Dana White watched Ian Machado-Garry have Islam Makhachev bleeding and hurting in the final round of UFC 330, and instead of finishing the job, Garry hugged him. White couldn't hide how much that decision bothered him.
You and Ian had a long conversation after the fight. What were you guys talking about?
Yeah, he's just like, listen, I know I'm one of the best in the world, and, I'll be back, 5 minutes ago. 5 minutes ago, if you'd have come out of that corner like a raging fucking bull, we might be having a different conversation right now.
Do you feel like Ian's too nice to his opponents?
I think that Ian's a classy guy is what I think. And, he always shows class. He did, before the fight, he goes over and shakes, all the corner's hands and all that stuff. It's great. But when that fucking bell rings, you got to switch. You got to switch all that shit off and go. And you definitely got to do it in the 5th round after he fought a great fight against Islam, who, everybody in this room and everybody else is saying, well, we might start talking about GOAT. You don't go shake the fucking GOAT's hand going into the 5th round. You come out to fucking annihilate him. I mean, that just has to be your mindset, in my humble opinion.
I felt like tonight was set up for the upset, White told reporters at the UFC 330 post-fight press conference. That's not a throwaway line. That's the UFC's own CEO, watching live from cageaside, genuinely believing Garry had a real path to shocking the world against a fighter riding a historic 17-fight winning streak. What happened instead, according to White, wasn't really about a lack of skill. It was about a lack of killer instinct at the exact moment it mattered most.
I think that Ian is a talented guy. If he had even an ounce of killer instinct in that 5th round, he had been beating him to the body. Islam's whole, I think, right side was beat up. His face was beat up. You don't come out and hug and shake hands in the fight. That shit drives me fucking crazy when there's so much at stake. And there's also, a lot of mental, gamesmanship, whatever you want to call it in this game. You come out in that 5th round with a flying knee or something crazy and you try to finish the fight. I think that this is one of those fights that Ian will go back and watch and say, fuck.
Ian is a talented guy. If he had even an ounce of killer instinct, in that 5th round he was beating him to the body, White said, laying out exactly what made Garry's decision so frustrating to watch unfold. Islam's whole right side was beat up. His face was beat up. You don't come out and hug and shake hands. Wow, that shit drives me crazy. Think about what White is actually describing there. This wasn't a fighter losing every exchange and settling for a respectful finish out of necessity. This was a fighter who'd landed enough clean, damaging shots to visibly mark up the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the world, heading into the single most important 5 minutes of his entire career, and choosing a hug over a finishing sequence. The moment White is referring to happened right at the start of round 5. Rather than coming out with urgency against a champion who was visibly hurting, Garry rushed to the center of the octagon and embraced Makhachev before the two separated and traded strikes for the rest of the round. It was the culmination of an approach Garry had carried throughout the entire fight, exchanging high fives, fist bumps, and friendly pats on breaks, treating a welterweight title fight with a level of sportsmanship rarely seen at this stage of a championship bout. That sportsmanship didn't stop once the final horn sounded either. Even after the fight was over, Garry continued embracing Makhachev, showing real, visible respect toward the champion who just defended his title against him. When Khabib Nurmagomedov entered the octagon shortly afterward, Garry turned his attention there too, praising the former champion's legacy directly rather than showing any of the bitterness or frustration a fighter might reasonably feel after a hard-fought competitive loss. That consistency, respectful before the fight, respectful during the fight, respectful after the fight, is exactly what White seized on as the core problem, a mindset that never fully shifted into the ruthlessness a championship opportunity like this one demanded. White didn't fault Garry's character for any of it. If anything, he went out of his way to praise it. I think Ian is a classy guy, is what I think. He always shows class. Before the fight, he goes over and shakes all their corners' hands, White said. It's great, but when that bell rings, you've got to switch all that off and go. He made the point even sharper when discussing exactly who Garry was sharing the octagon with. "You definitely gotta do it in the 5th round. You don't shake the GOAT's hand in the 5th round. You go out to 5th-ing annihilate him." That's a genuinely pointed way to frame it. White wasn't simply annoyed by good sportsmanship in the abstract. He was frustrated that Garry extended that sportsmanship, specifically in the moment where a fighter is supposed to be at his most ruthless. Against an opponent White himself openly acknowledged the room was already discussing in GOAT terms. According to White, respecting Makhachev's legacy and trying to end it inside the cage should have been two completely separate things, and Garry let the first one bleed into the second at exactly the wrong time. White didn't stop at simply describing what happened. He offered Garry a specific alternative, the kind of finishing sequence he believed could have actually changed the outcome. "You come out in that 5th round with a flying knee and try to finish the fight," White said. That's about as direct as criticism gets from a UFC executive discussing a fighter's in-cage decision-making. Not a general call for more aggression, but a specific, almost prescriptive suggestion for exactly what White believed the moment called for. He closed his comments on the topic with something that sounded less like criticism and more like genuine sympathy for how Garry might feel once he actually re-watches the tape. "This is one of those fights that Ian will go back and say, 'Cole, I wish I could do that over again,'" White said. "If he came out and tried to destroy and win that last round with everything he had, it's a totally different fight." The numbers back up exactly what White was reacting to in real time. Garry clearly lost the 2nd round after getting knocked down, but in the 3rd, the one round every judge unanimously scored in his favor, he attempted 25 significant strikes from distance, a real, aggressive output that actually worked. Compare that to the 1st, 4th, and 5th rounds, where he threw just 2, 7, and 9 strikes respectively. Some of that drop-off came from Makhachev's constant takedown pressure, forcing Garry into a defensive posture. But White's read was that Garry also spent long stretches on the feet, throwing single, isolated rear kicks without any real follow-up, technically sound, but ultimately not enough volume to actually win those rounds on the cards. That specific detail matters because it wasn't just the 5th round hug that bothered White. It was part of a broader pattern throughout the fight of Garry having genuine moments of success, actual damage, actual competitive rounds, and not consistently building on them the way a fighter trying to pull off the biggest upset of the year typically needs to. What makes this criticism land even harder is that Makhachev himself, the man on the receiving end of all that unexpected respect, publicly agreed with White's read almost immediately afterward. Speaking about Garry's repeated embraces throughout the fight, Makhachev sounded genuinely confused by the whole approach. "Bro, I don't understand," Makhachev said. "This is a fight. We don't have to hug each other every round. We're going to war." He didn't frame it as a compliment either. "I respect all my opponents, but Ian respects too much." That's a notable moment in its own right. It's rare for a UFC champion to publicly critique a beaten opponent's approach in almost the exact same terms as the promotion's own CEO, but that's essentially what happened here. Both men, watching the same fight from completely different vantage points, arrived at the identical conclusion that Garry's respect for Makhachev, while genuine and admirable as a person, actively worked against him as a competitor in the moments that mattered most. This all comes in the immediate aftermath of one of the biggest wins of Makhachev's career, a result that extended his winning streak to 17 straight fights, breaking the all-time UFC record previously shared with Anderson Silva. That context makes White's frustration even more understandable in a way. It wasn't just that Garry lost a close competitive fight, it's that he lost it while genuinely threatening the kind of upset that would have dominated headlines for years, only to seemingly ease off the gas at the exact moment the opportunity was most alive. It's worth being fair to Garry here too, because White's criticism, however pointed, doesn't erase what he actually accomplished across the rest of the fight. He showed genuinely excellent takedown defense throughout, reversed positions on the ground at multiple points, and produced real, visible damage to Makhachev's face and body by the later rounds. Results that go well beyond what most of Makhachev's previous 17 opponents managed to produce. This wasn't a fighter who lacked the tools to compete. According to White's own framing, It was a fighter who had the tools and simply didn't fully commit to using all of them at the exact moment the fight was still genuinely winnable. That distinction matters heading into whatever comes next for Garry's career. A fighter criticized purely for lacking skill against the pound-for-pound number one typically sees his stock take a real hit. A fighter criticized specifically for being too respectful, too classy, too willing to acknowledge a legend's greatness in real time rather than exploiting a visible opening, walks away from that criticism with his standing largely intact. If anything, White's comments read less like a dismissal of Garry's potential and more like frustration born from genuinely believing Garry could have won, if only his mindset in that final round had matched the damage he'd already inflicted. That distinction matters heading into whatever comes next for Garry's career. A fighter criticized purely for lacking skill against the pound-for-pound number one typically sees his stock take a real hit. A fighter criticized specifically for being too respectful, too classy, too willing to acknowledge a legend's greatness in real time rather than exploiting a visible opening, walks away from that criticism with his standing largely intact. If anything, White's comments read less like a dismissal of Garry's potential and more like frustration born from genuinely believing Garry could have won, if only his mindset in that final round had matched the damage he'd already inflicted. There's also a broader lesson here that extends beyond just this single fight, one White himself seemed to be gesturing toward without saying it outright. Championship rounds in this sport have a long history of separating fighters who treat the moment as a technical exercise from fighters who treat it as the only thing that matters. Garry showed throughout this fight that he has the technical tools, the takedown defense, the reversals, the power to visibly mark up an elite opponent's face and body. What White's criticism suggests is that the next step in Garry's development isn't really about adding new skills at all. It's about learning exactly when to set the class and the sportsmanship aside entirely, even against a fighter he clearly, genuinely admires. So where does this actually leave Garry heading into his next chapter? A performance that pushed Makhachev to a genuinely competitive decision, undercut slightly by a final round where respect, according to both the UFC's own CEO and the man who beat him, got in the way of finishing what he'd started. Whether that becomes a defining lesson Garry carries into a potential rematch, or simply a footnote in an otherwise legitimate, career-elevating performance, depends entirely on how seriously he takes White's blunt assessment heading forward. What's your take on all of this? Did Garry's respectful approach genuinely cost him a shot at the upset, the way both White and Makhachev seem to believe, or was Makhachev's control simply too much regardless of how aggressively Garry approached that final round? It's a rare thing to see a UFC executive and the winning fighter arrive at nearly identical criticism of the loser's mindset, and that alone tells you how widely shared this specific read on the fight has become across the sport. Let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more UFC 330 Fallout coverage as it continues to develop.